It's autumn 1932. We're in Konstantinivka in eastern Ukraine. Maria Andreevna Tilna and her family are in a desperate situation. The hour is late. Maria, barely 10 years old, should be tucked up safely in her bed by now. Instead, she and her sisters are creeping through pitch darkness, headed for the collective grain fields. They must go at night. Since August, the law of the 5 ears of grain has been enforced. Taking corn from a field is no longer considered childish mischief. It's a theft of socialist property. People can be imprisoned for this transgression, or they can be shot, even children. So Maria and her sisters, their hearts pounding, fearful of being discovered, take what they can and disappear into the night. Back at home, they examine their haul. Although it's nothing much, a few scraps of grain, a handful of husks, they're thankful they will eat tonight. The meagre spoils, just enough to see them through to another day. And, to make matters even sweeter, they've actually escaped with their lives. Others are not so lucky, as Maria will later remember. There was one woman who had 4 little children. Her name was Secreta. She went to cut some wheat and got caught. Convicted. She died in jail. The harsh years of 1932 and 1933 will take many lives. Some will starve, some will rot in jail, some will be shot as an example to others. For those who live through it, the scars will stay with them for all time. This is the story of the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor. It's a bit of a myth that the armistice of 1918 brought peace to Europe. Across the continent, conflict either continued or erupted anew. Just ask the people of Estonia, Poland, Finland, Yugoslavia, Ireland, and of course, Ukraine. 4 years earlier, at the dawn of the First World War, Ukraine was divided between 2 empires, Russia in the east and Austria-Hungary in the west. Now, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 leaves Ukraine divided once again, this time across a more complex network of nation-states. Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Poland all gained lands in western Ukraine, while the central and eastern provinces found themselves under the control of the newly formed Soviet Union. It was an awkward situation that pleased basically no one, least of all the Ukrainian separatists. For more than 4 years, from 1917, the Ukrainian People's Army fought a bloody war of independence against Soviet forces, White Russian forces, and at various points against Polish and Romanian forces too. When the war finally came to an end in 1921, the Soviet Union occupied most of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, or SSR, was born. Moscow had its victory, but the bitter fighting had rattled the Kremlin. To ensure lasting peace, they took certain measures designed to appease any potential separatists. In 1925, the Communist Party of Ukraine introduced a program of Ukrainianization at their April plenum. Ukrainian language and culture were not to be discarded, but embraced. From education and publishing to trade union organization and party governance, most aspects of political, public and private life were Ukrainianized from the mid-1920s onwards. This meant conducted in the Ukrainian language rather than in Russian. But this was a concession to Ukraine, not a reward. The central government in Moscow was concerned about another rebellion, and they would be keeping a close eye on the SSR. But who exactly was this they, and whose eye exactly would be fixed on Ukraine? Well, it certainly wasn't Vladimir Lenin, not anymore at least. A series of strokes had left the Soviet leader partially paralysed, and his days were numbered. Understanding his health was failing, Lenin's thoughts turned towards his end, and towards his successor. The Soviet Union was not an autocracy, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. Lenin couldn't just pick his next successor, but he could guide the council towards the right choice, and away from the wrong one. In December 1922, the ailing Lenin gave a warning. Comrade Stalin has concentrated an enormous power in his hands, and I'm not sure that he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution. In January 1923, Lenin went further, advising that the next leader should be someone very different to Stalin, someone who was more patient, more loyal, more polite, and more attentive to comrades, less capricious than Stalin. It was, of course, all too late. By 1924, Lenin was dead and Stalin had already made his move. He led the Union of Soviets first in a troika with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, but then, as this fell apart in 1925, Mr. Joseph Stalin ruled alone. The unchecked power that Lenin had warned about was now Stalin's. Many believed it was this power that spelt disaster for Ukraine, as a combination of natural disaster, political ineptitude, and straight-up theft conspired to rob her of her dignity. 7 years later, and the optimism of Ukrainianization was giving way to despair. Ukraine was starving, her people turning to desperate measures just to stay alive. Maria Andreeva Tilna, the little girl who'd risked death or imprisonment to take simple corn from the fields, remembers how people struggled to survive during these turbulent years. In the chickens' excrement from the collective farm were grains of wheat. We gathered that excrement, brought it all home, and started to boil it. We didn't die, but we were intoxicated for 2 days. This intoxication is saltpeter poisoning. Found in chicken droppings, saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, causes severe abdominal pain followed by nausea and diarrhea. Maria and her family were dangerously expelling what little nutrients they were able to ingest. In the Sayivka village, Donetsk, Maria Volkova remembers foraging for weed roots, eating them straight from the ground. Many of these roots would have been poisonous. At school, children had become so weak by then that they were unable to stand in a line. They would collapse and excrete blood as a consequence of eating all sorts of weeds. Many became swollen and distended from the lack of food. As Maria Volkova says, people were all so ill that their stomachs were swollen. Their hands and feet looked as though they had been pumped up with water. And when food was actually available, the sudden rush of nourishment made people violently sick. Maria Volkova again. In 1932, pumpkins planted in the spring grew, and my grandmother fed them to us. We ate a piece of the pumpkin, but without anything else. We developed serious stomach problems, standing in line at school, feeling faint and needing to run to the toilet. Diarrhea. Incessant diarrhea. Many were driven to desperation by the hunger, losing themselves to its incessant gnawing. Evdokia Dusia Maric remembers her mother's misery after her father died in the street. My mother was left all alone, without any food to give us. She took off her ring and earrings and went to trade them for food. We waited for her. She never came back. Maria Tilna recalls how some made even more horrifying decisions. One old woman ate her child. The woman was old, but she did eat her baby. That's how it was in 1933. It stays forever with you. It is engraved in my mind forever. By early 1933, death was a regular sight across Ukraine, as Reverend Mikhail Khotorny from the central city of Kryvyi Rih tells us. The famine was not hidden. We would see dead bodies in the streets as we went to the banks of the river to pull up the reeds to eat. Katerina Buryak explained how almost her entire family was wiped out in Kherson, Ukraine's south. My 8-month-old sister Oksana was the first to die because my mother did not have any milk to feed her. Then Helena, my 3-year-old sister, died, followed by my older brother, Philip. My mother kept telling my father to go and work on the kolkhots, the collective farms, where he would at least receive something to eat. He said that he would sooner die than work there. Sadly, that's what happened. He died, leaving only my mother and me. Like Maria Tilna, Katerina never forgot the trauma of those years. It's very difficult for me to talk about the Holodomor, she said in 2008. Every time I think about it, I just want to cry. The way the bodies were dealt with also gave chilling clues as to the mechanisms of control and repression at work. Vasil Zaika wrote in a memoir about his own experiences in the eastern Donbass region. One night in May 1933, I witnessed how drunken policemen or OGPU secret police operatives, aided by some criminal elements who always seemed to hang around the police, loaded the dead and half-dead onto trucks. The criminals, who were also drunk, paired up, took the bodies by the legs and arms and then threw them onto the trucks as if they were firewood. They always did this at night, so residents wouldn't know where the bodies were taken or what was done with them. It's hard to know just how many people died in the famine. Across the Soviet Union, it's believed that somewhere between 5.7 and 8.7 million people lost their lives. While many regions suffered, none were hit harder than Kazakhstan and Ukraine. Of a total Soviet population of 147 million in 1926, these two republics contributed just 6.5 million and 29 million respectively, or around 4.4% and 19.7% of everyone in the USSR. And yet, a disproportionate number of Kazakhs and Ukrainians died. Between 1.5 and 2.3 million died during the Kazakh famine, or Ashashalik as it's known, and as many as 3.9 million died in the Ukrainian Holodomor. Vast swathes of Ukraine experienced a death toll between 10 and 40% of the local population. In some areas, such as in the Vinnytsia Oblast to Kiev's south, or Abazivka, west of Poltava, the death rate was above 50%. Staggering numbers. So staggering, in fact, that many suspected foul play. That very name, Holodomor, is made up of two words, holod, hunger, and more, extermination. This reflects the feelings of many Ukrainians. This was no accident. This was a planned famine, an extermination, an attempted, silent genocide. So, let's take a closer look at what led us here to Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, staring death in the face. There are several different factors at play, some political, some natural, and some altogether more sinister. But let's start with the political. Since the mid-1920s, Stalin wanted to make the USSR the industrial envy of the world. This meant stepping up production in a huge way, implementing a 5-year plan that would achieve a surging industrial growth rate. But Stalin wasn't exactly sure of how he was going to achieve his goals. He wasn't even certain on what the goals were. The first 5-year plan was supposed to come into effect in October 1928, outlining steps towards an industrial growth rate of 20%. In the end, the plan was 6 months late, and was not even finished by the time it was launched in April 1929. Despite the setback, by that same winter, Stalin had doubled the target to almost 40%. Meanwhile, in the countryside, Soviet agriculture underwent a process of collectivization. Essentially, this meant confiscating the property of landowners and working it collectively for the good of the state. In Ukraine and elsewhere, this brought Stalin into direct conflict with much of the region's peasantry, while Soviet communism rested on the fundamental idea of the proletariat against the elite. The truth wasn't always so clear-cut. Many peasants had grown relatively wealthy under the Tsar, owning their own land, employing their own workers, and selling their own produce across the country. In Stalin's eyes, these were kulaks, and they were the enemies of the people. They were also a significant obstacle to collectivization. And so, on December 27, 1929, Stalin acted. He decreed that the kulaks as a class must be liquidated, in the words of the General Secretary himself. Now we have the opportunity to carry out a resolute offensive against the kulaks, break their resistance, eliminate them as a class, and replace their production with collectivized production. From January 30th, 1930 onwards, kulaks could be evicted from their property and forced into local labour colonies. They could be sent to Siberia, or they could simply be shot, depending on their level of perceived threat. But rather than energising the countryside, this process of dekulakization brought agriculture to a standstill. Previously productive areas of farmland were now being mismanaged and mishandled by inexperienced workers, and grain production all of a sudden took a nosedive. But the country simply could not afford grain production to be hobbled down. With industrialization continuing at pace in the cities, the Soviet Union's grain demand was higher than ever before. All of this was a dangerous cocktail, and it was pushing the USSR to the brink. In the words of historian Peter Stamper, the lower crop yield was coupled with an ever-growing demand for grain in this period, the result of Stalin's radical economic policies. For this reason, Stalin and his policymakers can be identified as the Holodomor's principal cause. These policymakers had made the USSR extremely vulnerable to famine and natural disaster, and natural disasters were already taking place. From 1927 to 1928, the Zhut came to Kazakhstan, a period of bitterly cold weather that wiped out crops and cattle across the Central Asian region. Unstable weather continued into the 1930s. The winter of 1930 to 1931 was abnormally long, stretching far into the spring. Cold snaps and rainy storms set sowing back by weeks. In the Lower Volga region, agricultural workers worked desperately in any window of good weather that they could find. As one report said, literally every hour and every day have to be grabbed for sowing. It was clear that there was a real problem with food production and availability, and that this impacted the entire Soviet Union, not just Ukraine. But there's something striking that emerges again and again from the testimonies of those who were there. The idea that, yes, times were hard, but it shouldn't have been anything like that. Ukraine was still producing enough to weather the storm. A testimony from Ivan Kasyanenko in 1988 describes how 1932 began positively for his Ukrainian village. The harvest was a normal one, he said, and it was brought in before anyone could even suspect anything untoward. Then things changed. It was winter when they came in to take the grain that had already been ground into flour and was sorted into bags. They came and seized all of this grain from all 6,000 villagers. The grain seizures were incredibly traumatic events, characterized by violence, as Ivan explained further. The sound of crying was everywhere. Those who seized the grain carried out their orders without mercy. I remember how a man ran away, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. They took absolutely everything. Cows, pigs, everything. There was nothing left for the wife. She sent her children to fend for themselves, set fire to the house, and hanged herself. Stories like these are told again and again throughout the crisis. Stories of food produced, then confiscated, of people left to starve. Teacher Alexandra Radchenko puts it in even starker terms. Horrific thievery has developed. I fear famine so much. I fear it for the children. God protect us and have mercy on us. It would not be so offensive if there were a poor crop, but the grain has been taken away and an artificial famine created. As food shortages grew, the law of 5 years of grain was enacted on August 7, 1932. Now, those who took more than 5 ears from the field could be imprisoned indefinitely, sent to a labour camp, or even executed. The prohibitions extended to other crops too, as Ivan Dohopiat remembered. In the spring, the real crimes began. Potato was sown, and people dug them up to eat. And they caught and killed them all. By October 1932, Stalin's wrath had Ukraine in a stranglehold. He placed impossible quotas on grain and other agricultural products. That autumn, the red trains crisscrossed the countryside. These convoys of carts carried grain in great abundance, away from the collective farms of Ukraine, to be delivered elsewhere. As Y. Shrets from Horzhena in central Ukraine complained, our cooperative has 1,052 people to be fed. In 1931, most of us were starving. In 1932, the cooperative sowed 600 hectares of grain crops. When the District Executive Committee apportioned the grain procurement plan, we had to provide 2,400 poods, around 45 tons, of grain. The quotas were literally bleeding Ukraine dry. Even if the collectives could hit these targets, there'd be nothing left over to feed the country and themselves. And so to meet these targets meant death. But Stalin wasn't backing down. That same month, he sent his best man to Ukraine, Vyacheslav Molotov. Molotov would personally oversee the grain collection, driving them to horrific extremes. Viril Morochko of the Holodomor Research Institute believes that Molotov and his teams could just about skim 3 million tons of grain off the top once Ukraine's own domestic needs were met. In the end, they exported 7 million tons. Not only were the Ukrainians being worked to death, but the resources required to sustain them were being siphoned away. As Vasil himself says, Molotov did not thresh grain with a flail. He crushed human destinies and the lives of millions with criminal initiatives. And all of this was getting rapidly worse. In November 1932, the policy of the blackboards was introduced. If grain procurement quotas were not hit by a district, a village, or even just a collective farm, then those deemed responsible were listed on the blackboard. Historian Daria Mattingly explains what this would have meant. All provisions, essential items like food, matches, kerosene, and salt, along with anything in storage or village shops, would be confiscated. To enforce the blackboards, the authorities called in the military. Rings of soldiers would surround persecuted villages, trapping residents inside. In January 1933, as people sought to escape the famine, another decree was passed. Ukrainians could not leave the Ukrainian SSR. This essentially meant the borders with Russia and Belarus were sealed, and Ukraine was cut off from the world. In the first month following the new decree, hundreds of thousands attempted to escape. Some 200,000 were caught and returned to Ukraine through punitive filtration camps. Over the next year, the Soviet Union attempted to create scapegoats for the disaster, purging leading Communist Party officials in Ukraine and appointing Pavel Postyshev as the leader of the Ukrainian SSR. But the famine worsened. June 1933, the grimmest month of the Holodomor, saw 28,000 deaths a day. That autumn, some 117,000 Russian and Belarusian farmers would be resettled in Ukrainian areas wiped out by the famine, an attempt to sweep the disaster under the rug, to replace the Ukrainian lives lost, and move on without flinching. In time, the famine was declared over, but a bad harvest in 1934 meant Ukraine's suffering continued. The official time frame for the Holodomor is a single year, from 1932 to 33, but the hardship continued far beyond this. Returning to historian Daria Mattingly, she's under no illusion of what went on in Ukraine during those years. Holodomor was a man-made famine, but also the concurrent persecution of the Ukrainian political elite, intelligentsia, and church. And the Kremlin certainly had previous here. The policy of Ukrainization had initially brought hope to the region, but this was swiftly reversed. From the late 1920s onwards, the Soviet Union destroyed thousands of Ukrainian churches, arresting the priests and shattering the old modes of worship. For Mattingly, the Ukrainian situation worsened significantly after collectivization. People often ask me, how could a man-made famine happen in 20th century Europe? Does it mean taking away all the food? And I tell them, that's exactly what happened. Collectivization created the mechanism that made the Holodomor possible. Writers like Natalia Ponedilok and Yaroslava Buchta agree. They describe the Holodomor as a genocide against the Ukrainian nation. As of 2025, 35 world governments now use the same classification. The Russian government is not among them. Back in the 1930s, however, the eyes of the world were blind to Ukraine's plight. In the view of the international community, the Soviet Union was legitimizing itself, becoming a global power that would need a say in international geopolitics. The United States formally recognized the USSR in 1933, while the Holodomor continued, and the Kremlin received its invitation to the League of Nations the following year. 5 years after this, Nazi Germany would sign a non-aggression pact with the USSR, cementing the idea of the Soviet Union as a key global power. This non-aggression pact would turn out to be a disaster, barely worth the paper it was printed on. Not that this would be any consolation for the Ukrainians. In fact, it was the Ukrainians and other ordinary Soviets who would foot the bill once again as the abject misery of the Second World War came to the USSR. At least 8 million Ukrainians died in the conflict, including up to 6 million civilians. The total number of Soviet civilian and military dead may be as high as 24 million. And another famine would strike in the aftermath. Of the 900,000 believed to have perished in the 1946 to 1947 famine, 400,000 died in Ukraine and neighbouring Moldova. Again, great hardship had come to the Soviet Union, and again, Ukraine bore its brunt. 9 decades have passed since the Holodomor ravaged Ukraine. The disaster is now at the very fringes of living memory. Voices from the tragedy still echo down the years, however. Some are with us. When Maria Andreevna Tilna shared her experiences in 2021, she was 99 years old and still living in Konstantinivka. Lubiov Yarosh is another survivor. She was 102 years old when she was interviewed in Khodorkiv in 2023, sharing her bitter memories of losing a brother and a sister to the disaster and almost losing her own life. Fiercely proud of her culture and her people, Lyubov still busies herself as a volunteer for her native Ukraine. Her work is symbolic of a nation once again facing the threat of destruction. She makes camouflage suits for Ukraine's sniper units. In time, we will lose these voices too. They will join those who have been lost in the intervening years and those who never made it beyond the hunger and horror of 1933. And when that day comes, we must strive to keep the flames of remembrance burning for the Holodomor and to honour the memory of those forced to experience it.